In 1947, J.R.R. Tolkien published a short story titled Leaf by Niggle. And in this story, we're introduced to a small, somewhat peculiar man named Niggle who lives by himself in the countryside and is consumed by his life's single passion, painting. The townspeople, along with Niggle's sole neighbors, Mr. and Mrs. Parrish, had long questioned the usefulness of his vocation and work, but that didn't deter Niggle. He was fixated on this one particular painting he envisioned. Originally, it started out in his mind as a single leaf blowing in the wind. But he soon realized it wasn't just a leaf he had to paint. The leaf was connected to a magnificent tree. The most fantastic roots thrusting into the ground below, strange birds perched on some of the branches, and through the gaps in between the leaves, you could see a countryside open up in the distance. A glimpse of a forest beyond that, and snow-capped mountains in the furthest horizon. The canvas kept getting larger and larger, so much so that he needed a ladder to reach the top of it. I mean, this would be the fullest expression of his labor as an artist, his magnum opus, his life's crowning achievement. He knew he'd have to block out everything else to finish this work because, well, you see, there was a journey he had to take. A final journey to a distant place. And at some point, probably quite soon, a man would come with horse and carriage, and he'd have to leave with him, never to return. And so Niggle began his work on this great tree. The problem, however, was that he kept getting interrupted. First it was jury duty. Then a distant friend became ill. Then his neighbor, Mr. Parrish, had back pain. Then visitors from the town kept stopping by. Apparently they liked the idea of having tea in the countryside. And when they'd asked to come visit, Niggle couldn't say no. According to Tolkien, Niggle wasn't particularly kind. In fact, Niggle often cursed these interruptions in his heart. His heart wasn't kind, but it was soft. And whenever people needed his help or hospitality, he'd feel uncomfortable denying them, and so he'd eventually oblige. And then one day, there was a knock on his door. It was Parrish, telling Niggle that his wife had become ill. He wondered if Niggle could go to town and fetch the doctor. Furthermore, the recent storm had blown off some of the tiles from Parrish's roof, and so if Niggle could also put it in a word with the town's builder, fetch him as well. See, Niggle had a bicycle, and Parrish didn't, and even if Parrish did have a bicycle, he had a bad leg. It caused him a great deal of pain. So Niggle was stuck here. He had a picture to paint and barely time to finish it, and a part of Niggle wondered whether Parrish's wife had just a common cold. But he found himself saying okay, and he set off for town, fetching the doctor and builder. On his way home, back to the countryside, riding in his bicycle in the wind and rain, he became soaked to the bone and caught a chill himself. And so when the doctor finally arrived the next day, he now had two patients to deal with, Mrs. Parrish and Niggle. Niggle lay in bed for days with a high fever, but at the end of a week or so, he finally had the strength to get out of bed and resume his work on the magnificent tree. He climbed the ladder, he began to paint, and just as he was really getting into it, there was yet another knock on the door. This time it was a tall man, a complete stranger, and he identified himself as the driver of the horse and carriage ordered long ago. "It has come at last," the driver said. "You start today on your long journey." And beginning to weep, Niggle grabbed a small bag of his essentials and left for the long journey, never to return. Sometime later, the townspeople came by Niggle's house, and they saw the enormous canvas with the unfinished painting on it. They actually found it quite useful to use for patching up the roof of Mr. Parrish's house. A corner of the canvas, however, had been torn off, and a long time later, a townsperson found it lying in a field, a mountaintop with a spray of leaves. It was brittle, though, from being outside for so long, so most of the corner crumpled apart, except for one beautiful leaf. The townsperson left it with the town museum. They framed and hung it on a wall in the corner. A few eyes saw it. It was titled Leaf by Niggle. But eventually, the museum burned down, and the leaf, along with Nigel, were forgotten altogether. Now, that's the end of Nigel's painting, but it's not actually the end of Nigel. See, the long journey first landed him in some sort of hospital for quite some time, and eventually he was permitted to go to a distant countryside. And as he began to walk around in this distant countryside, he realized that the hills and the grass, they felt strangely familiar, like he'd seen them somehow before. And as he was walking along, suddenly something was blocking the sun's light from hitting him, and so he turned to see what it was, and it was a tree. A magnificent tree with fantastic roots thrusting into the ground below, strange birds perched on its branches, and between the leaves you could see a forest beyond and still snow-capped mountains in the furthest horizon. As he examined the leaves of the tree, he realized they were somehow, some way, his leaves. He had made, in some sense, those precise leaves. But upon further inspection, it struck him that the leaves were not made solely by him, but were made in collaboration with Parrish. And no sooner had this hit him when a man came strolling by. It was, in fact, Parrish in the distant countryside with him. And they soon realized they worked quite well together, and they began beautifying and building and creating an even more magnificent landscape together. We're in a series right now titled Everyday Spirituality, and you're wondering, am I going to explain the story? Not really. I'll get to it a little bit later, but in this series, we're looking at the stuff of everyday, ordinary life, the practices we engage in almost every single day, and we're asking the question, what does this have to do with God? What does this have to do with our life with God? If we were made for relationship with God, to walk with Him at every moment of every day, well, then what does it mean to walk with Him when we eat and when we work, when we shop and when we play? What does it mean to live with God in the everyday stuff of life? So we've talked about sleeping, waking up, getting ready, traveling. Last week we began talking about work, and this morning we're going to talk about work yet again. If you missed last week, I would highly encourage you to listen to our sermon podcast, because this morning's sermon is really the second half of a two-part sermon on work. Last week we looked at Genesis 1, 2, and 3 together, and we saw that work was created to be good, created to be meaningful, and it still is, although it's fraught with pain and sin and various other complications. I have 2 points I want to make this morning, and you can tell what they are by the title of this sermon. The first is this: work is an occasion or opportunity for love. So there are countless scriptures that we could look at, particularly in the Old Testament law, but I want to show you just a few passages from the Old Testament, and these passages show us that in our work, we have the opportunity to love and care for others. Maybe an obvious point, but I still want to show you these passages. We want to look at them together. The first couple are actually going to be shown in the negative, meaning what you're going to see is passages about the negative impact of bad work. Proverbs 10:26, like vinegar to the teeth and smoke to the eyes, so are the lazy to their employers. So here, specifically, it's lazy work that negatively impacts someone else, namely an employer. A lazy employee is like vinegar to an employer's teeth, smoke to their eyes, a nuisance, a bother. They want to spit it out. If you're an employer, you know this experience. Proverbs 18, verse 9, whoever is slack in his work is a brother to him who destroys. So what this is saying here is that, again, lazy work is close kin to destructive work. There's not much difference, in other words, between being a lazy worker and a destructive worker, someone who destroys rather than builds. So both of these passages are obviously put in the negative. They demonstrate the opposite of care for others, the opposite of love. They show how bad work hurts other people. Leviticus 19:13, you shall not keep for yourself the wages of the laborer until morning. So this one is not for employee, it's for employer, right? about the just treatment specifically of day laborers in this case. Exodus 20, verse 12, 6 days you shall do your work, on the seventh you shall rest, so that your ox and your donkey may have relief, and your homeborn servant and the resident alien may be refreshed. So this rule about the Sabbath is also found in the Ten Commandments, in Exodus 20, Deuteronomy 5. And in all three passages, they include a command for employers again, right? Sabbath, in other words, is not just for you if you're an employer, it's also for those who work for you. So make sure that they're able to rest and be refreshed. Don't overwork them is the idea. You'll notice in this passage that even donkeys or oxen are included as well. So also Proverbs 12:10, whoever is righteous has regard for the life of his animal, but the mercy of the wicked is cruel. So you might be disappointed, but this is not about pets. I mean, it can perhaps be extended to include pets, but Israelites didn't have pets. This is about work animals. And notice, though, that again, similar to the Sabbath passage, they are to be treated with regard. Leviticus 19:35, you shall not cheat in measuring length, weight, or quantity. You shall have honest balances, honest weights, an honest ephah, and an honest hin. So this is about honest work in commerce or in the marketplace. So I know we went through that very quickly, but what we already saw is that work should be hard, not lazy. Work should be done with kindness, right, towards those in your employ, and work should be done honestly, right? Hard work, kind work, honest work. Now, this is the essence of the Old Testament law about work. Jesus, of course, sums up the law in the Old Testament quite nicely. He says it's about loving God and loving your neighbor. And you could say that these passages, and we could look at countless others, are about loving your neighbor in the workplace. In our work, we interact with employers, employees, coworkers, animals perhaps, customers. And our work can either be an occasion for love, an opportunity for us to love and care for those around us, or not. Very few of us work alone, right? Even if you work from home, you probably don't work alone, and in your work you can love others or not. Okay, so there's a second point actually to be made here about work being an occasion for love. I want to show you a passage from 1 Thessalonians, written by the Apostle Paul, and just to give you a little bit of background, in addition to planting churches and teaching theology and all that kind of stuff in local churches, Paul works as a tent maker. We learn that from the book of Acts. And that is the work that you're going to see him referencing here. So deeply do we care for you that we're determined to share with you not only the gospel of God, but also our own selves, because you have become very dear to us. You remember our labor and toil, brothers and sisters. We worked night and day so that we might not burden any of you while we proclaim to you the gospel of God. He says something very similar to this in 2 Thessalonians, so to the same church, just written sometime later, chapter 3, verse 7. You yourselves know how you ought to imitate us. We were not idle when we were with you. We did not eat anyone's bread without paying for it, but with toil and labor we worked night and day so that we might not burden any of you. This is not because we do not have that right, but in order to give you an example to imitate. So what he's saying is that when he was in Thessalonica, leading the church there, and I'm sure that included, that was a lot of work in itself, he could have exclusively worked for the church and received financial support from them. And Paul does, in fact, do this in other places. He does receive financial support from other churches, but not Thessalonica. We actually learned from 2 Corinthians that the Thessalonian church was very poor. They're actually very generous, but they were very poor as well. And so why does Paul labor making tents in Thessalonica? Not because he wants to, right? Not because he is all his life he's been envisioning the most magnificent tent and he just needs the time and space to produce it. No. He works night and day making tents to make money. But he does so out of love for the Thessalonians, to lessen their burden, so that he doesn't need to accept this poor church's financial help. And he then encourages them in their passage to see their own work the same way, as a means of making money and so loving one another. 1 Thessalonians 4:9. He's more explicit about this. Now concerning love of the brothers and sisters, you do not need to have anyone write to you, for you yourselves have been taught by God to love one another, and indeed you do love. But we urge you, beloved, to do so more and more, to aspire to live quietly, to mind your affairs, and to work with your hands as we directed you, so that you may behave properly towards outsiders and be dependent on no one. He means financially dependent on no one there. So I would just want you, we can't go into this passage in any detail, but I want you to notice, again, the connection between love and work. You do love, but love even more so, he says. How? Living quietly, minding your own affairs, and working with your hands. Here is the point. When you think about work and its purpose, don't just think about the work itself. Your work is actually part of a larger fabric that is your life. A larger fabric that includes family and neighbors and friends and a church community. And part of the reason why we work, it's not just the work itself, but the way it allows us to care for other people, so that we can support ourselves, so that we can support others, so that we can lessen the burden of our brothers and sisters. Do you see that in the Thessalonians passage? Some years ago, I was pastoring college students, and every now and again, I would teach them about vocation. They were changing majors all the time. They're trying to figure out, what do I do? What's going to be my work, my future work? They don't want to make the wrong decision, right? And I'm not making light of that if you're a college student there right now. Good luck. But anyways, just kidding. So I was trying to help pastor them, help them figure it out. And so I don't know where I had gotten this from, but I had heard somewhere, and I thought it was pretty brilliant. I still think it's kind of brilliant. Two questions you can ask when you're trying to discern your future work. The first question is this: what are you most passionate about? What are you most passionate? A variation of that question is, how are you most gifted? The second question is, where is the world hurting? And so what I would teach them is that your work should be the intersection of your passions and gifts and abilities and the world's pain, the world's hurt, the world's need. Pretty brilliant, right? I like that. I still like it. I think it still sounds it's pretty awesome. But it dawned on me a few years ago, and then I became quite embarrassed that I had been teaching it for so long, that those questions regarding work were really only possible for the middle and upper classes in contemporary society, right? I mean, they're not bad questions. And listen, don't mishear me. If you are privileged to ask those questions, to be able to consider them, by all means do so. But if you're the working poor, barely able to get by, those questions are just frankly cruel, right? I assure you, not all migrant workers from Central and South America just so happen to all be gifted and passionate equally about picking strawberries 12 hours a day in the summer heat. Not all workers are passionate about and gifted for cleaning toilets or bussing tables or working on a factory line. Historically, those questions make no sense at all as well. In most other times and places, you don't become a blacksmith because you're so passionate about iron and horseshoes. You become a blacksmith because your dad was one. That's the family business. And here's the point I'm actually trying to make. There is nothing wrong or shameful about working as a means of making money, even if that means that you're stuck doing something you don't in fact love. I think there's this kind of subtle shaming that happens, and usually it's intergenerational, from the younger towards the older. I used to see this in the attitudes of some of my former college students, and I probably helped them along by teaching those questions. There's this subtle shaming towards people who choose a profession or job because of its security and money. Oh, they missed what life's really all about, they'd say. They sold out. Nonsense. The truth is that it's likely the case that their sacrifice afforded their children the luxury of choosing work they love. Is it a wonderful gift to be able to do what you love in work? Oh, absolutely. I would wish and pray that for everyone, right? That's the goal, that our paid work would be at the intersection of those two things, our passions and our gifts and the world's greatest needs. Here's the point, though. Even if you're not able to do what you love in your work can still be an act of love. That's the point. Not just as you care for your coworkers and your employers and your employees and all those you interact with in the workplace, but also as you work hard to be able to provide financially, for yourself, for those around you, for your neighbors, for your church. That kind of work matters too. See, humans are not just workers. They're also fathers and mothers and sons and daughters and neighbors and friends and citizens and even church congregants. And the obligations that arise from all those relationships are a part of our work and why it all matters. Remember that strange story about Nigel? When he inspected the great tree in the far-off country, he noticed as he stared at those beautiful leaves that they were his leaves, but they were made somehow in collaboration with parish. By the way, I don't know if you know what the word parish means. It's the area around a church. It's your neighbors. It's all the people who live in proximity to you. What does this mean exactly? What does it mean that the leaves, upon closer inspection, were made in collaboration with parish? Well, Tolkien doesn't explain, but I wonder if we're supposed to rethink what Nigel's work was to begin with. Was it just the painting? Was it just the single, solitary, triumphant expression of his artistic genius captured on that canvas? Or did his real work, his real vocation, his real calling also include all the so-called interruptions, all the so-called other obligations, even the interruptions and the obligations that kept him from finishing what he thought was his real work? I'll just let this sit with you, but you can either view the people around you, your neighbors, your family, your kids if you have them, your church, you can view them as obstacles and interruptions to your life's great achievement, to your life's great work, or you can view them as part of the work itself. Your work is an occasion for loving others. Second, work is an occasion for joy. So Ecclesiastes in the Old Testament is the book in the Bible that talks more about work than anywhere else in Scripture. And it says something very interesting about work, and I'm not sure if we believe it, but Ecclesiastes 2:24 says, "There is nothing better for mortals than to eat and drink and find enjoyment in their toil." Ecclesiastes 3:13, "It is God's gift that all should eat and drink and take pleasure in all their toil." Ecclesiastes 3:22, "There's nothing better than that all should enjoy their work, for that is their lot." 5:18, "This is what I've seen to be good. It is fitting to eat and drink and find enjoyment in all the toil with which one toils under the sun, the few days of life God gives us." I'm not sure if we're getting the point regarding toil and work, but apparently we should enjoy it. Take pleasure in it. The writer of Ecclesiastes says that work should be enjoyable. It's God's gift to us. So why isn't it? Right? Why isn't it? Why isn't work fun? Why isn't it work more pleasurable? I mean, it can be for some of us some of the time, but those moments, let's be honest, feel way too few and far between. I mean, we already mentioned some reasons last week, right? How work can be oppressive, how work can be enslaving. We get mixed results. It's painful. But the writer of Ecclesiastes gives us some other reasons that work isn't enjoyable. Obstacles to finding pleasure in our toil. And one obstacle, he says, is that we have this insatiable appetite for the fruits of our labor. Whatever our labor is supposed to produce, we always want more and more. It doesn't satisfy. So take one of those fruits, money. Ecclesiastes 5:10. "The lover of money will not be satisfied with money, nor the lover of wealth with gain." And then Ecclesiastes 6:7. "All human toil is for the mouth." What that means is that we work so that we can eat, right? All human toil is for the mouth, yet the appetite is not satisfied. What he's saying here in both of these passages is that the fruits of our labor are rarely enough. We have this insatiable appetite or craving for more. We want something, in other words, we want something in our work that we just can never feel like we can get from it. Lasting satisfaction, lasting fulfillment. Another obstacle is found in the passage you heard read before I came up here. Ecclesiastes 2, verse 18, "I hated all my toil, in which I toiled under the sun, seeing that I must leave it to those who come after me. And who knows whether they will be wise or foolish?" Yet they'll be master of all for which I toiled and used my wisdom under the sun. This also is vanity. So I turned and gave my heart up to despair concerning all the toil of my labors under the sun, because sometimes one who has toiled with wisdom and knowledge and skill must leave all to be enjoyed by another who did not toil for it. This also is vanity, a great evil. What do mortals get from all the toil and strain with which they toil under the sun? For all their days are full of pain. Their work is a vexation. Even at night, their minds do not rest. This also is vanity. Now, this is a pretty depressing passage on work, is it not? But I want to point out that he's actually talking about an obstacle to finding joy in our work. I mean, it's the same writer who says the greatest thing in life is to eat and drink and enjoy your work. We're to take pleasure in it. We're to find enjoyment in it. And so what he's explaining here is one of the main obstacles to experiencing the joy of work. And could you tell what it was in this passage? The word I'd use to describe it is legacy. The desire for lasting impact. The desire for lasting significance, which is always frustrated by this very common human experience called death. I mean, even when you retire, let alone when you die, people will come after you, and who knows whether they'll be wise or foolish, right? Who knows whether they will preserve all the work that you work so hard on, or whether they'll take it all apart. Yet they will be master over all that you toiled for, he says. So the first obstacle was a desire for lasting satisfaction or fulfillment from the fruit of our labor. We always want more out of it while we're working. And then the second obstacle is a desire for lasting impact, legacy, lasting significance. Elsewhere in the book of Ecclesiastes, the word that is used to describe this significance, this impact, this fulfillment, is the word translated in English as gain. And so he asks, rhetorically, in chapter 3, verse 9, what gain have the workers from their toil? Again, it's a rhetorical question of which the answer is nothing. Nothing. At least nothing that can be guaranteed, nothing that is certain, nothing that we know will last forever. The only one whose work we know will last forever is in fact God's. And just a few verses later, he explains this. I know that whatever God does, in contrast to humans, endures forever. Nothing can be added to it, nor anything taken from it. God has done this so that all should stand in awe before him. Here's the point he's trying to make. You know, we all want our work to matter, right? Don't we? Whether that's raising kids, whether that's working as an engineer, or as a business owner, or as a teacher of some kind, or a doctor, whatever it is, we all want our work to be significant, and yet his point is that none of it is guaranteed. Maybe it will. Who knows? Maybe there will be some sort of lasting impact. Who's to say? He's not saying it's impossible. We're just left not knowing. Old Testament scholar William Brown, who wrote an essay on the Ecclesiastes perspective on work, at the end of his essay shares a little story that kind of hits close to home for me. He shares a story, he shares about his close friend of his, a gifted pastor and devoted spouse and parent, who had not too long ago suddenly died in a tragic auto accident. And apparently just days before his untimely death, this pastor friend of his had received the results from a survey that was conducted among his congregation recently. And as he was looking through those survey results, again, just days before his untimely death, he was greatly disappointed. See, one of the questions that was asked was this: what of the church's ministries, or which church ministry, has been most impactful to you over the course of the past year? And he was greatly disappointed to see that rarely anyone mentioned worship, and no one mentioned his preaching and pastoral abilities. But instead, at the very top of the list of the most impactful ministries the church had provided over the course of the last year were potluck suppers. That probably hits me differently than that hits you for obvious reasons. When I read that, I found myself crying, but not out of sadness, but out of joy. A huge smile just crept over my face. I mean, I just want to point out something that's maybe interesting about this moment that I'm talking about work, that right now, we're like getting to our closing. Right now, I'm working. This is my work. It's more than that, but this is my work. This, in fact, as we move into the conclusion of this sermon, is the culminating moment of my work week. And I will tell you that it is such a huge relief for me. Genuinely, it is. It is a huge relief realizing that after today is long past, and you maybe reflect on this church's ministry, that you will be more impacted by the chili cook-off after service today than this sermon right now. It is a huge relief to me, actually. It is a huge relief to me to realize, to recognize that my desire for lasting impact, my desire for legacy, my desire for significance was a burden that my work was never intended to bear. The writer of Ecclesiastes is saying, if you can let go of your desire for gain, if you can let go of your desperate longing to make a name for yourself that you think will last forever, if you can let go of your obsession over your legacy, you can then actually receive your work as a surprising gift from God. And you can take great pleasure in it. Friends, we don't need to ensure our legacies. We don't need to burden our work with the impossible task of lasting forever. We can let go. We can let go because our identity and our future is not, of course, in our hands, not, of course, in our work. It's in God's hands. It's in God's work. God's work is the only work we know lasts forever. Why has He made it so? So that all should stand in awe before Him. Your real significance is found not in the name that you etch into this world. Your real significance is found not in the name you leave behind. I mean, friends, it's going to be forgotten. Your kids will remember, if you have them. Your grandkids maybe, but not as often as you'd hope. Your great-grandkids, probably not. And after that, good luck. Your real significance is found not in the name that you have written here on earth, but as Jesus explains in Luke chapter 10, because your name is written in heaven. And what that means is that although the world may not know you now through your work, certainly it won't 50 years from now, 100 years from now, 500 years from now. Although the world will not remember you, although the world will not know you, God does remember you. God does know you. In Jesus, God knows you. He knows, by the way, how much you've been toiling. He knows how much you've been struggling to create your magnum opus, and how all your other relational and covenantal obligations to other people, all the so-called interruptions, keep getting in the way of you trying to produce your masterpiece. God sees you toiling. He sees you struggling. And who knows, maybe one day in the life to come, in that distant countryside, we might end up finding that single leaf didn't last here on earth, but it did in the one to come. That our work matters after all. Let's pray.